Britain's history is long and filled with many dark recesses. In this compilation, we delve into a selection of true crimes that shocked the country. We begin with the story of a murder that took a life and destroyed a family. But was the person who eventually confessed to the crime the actual perpetrator? The prosperous Kent family lived in a spacious three-storied mansion, Road Hill House, here in the tiny village of Road in Somerset. The head of the household, 59-year-old Samuel Saville Kent, was a deputy inspector of clothing factories and was quite the upright and indeed pious man. Samuel and his first wife, Mary Ann Windus, married in 1829, and over the next 15 years, Mary would give birth to 10 children. Sadly, most of them would pass away at an early age, with only 4 surviving to witness the gruesome events of the summer of 1860. William, Mary, Elizabeth and Constance. Despite, or perhaps because of these many births, Mary Ann became a sickly woman, suffering readily from physical illness and anxiety. Because of this, Samuel eventually hired a governess named Mary Drew Pratt to take care of the house and children. On May the 5th, 1852, Mary Ann suddenly passed away from a bowel obstruction, and it wasn't long afterwards that rumours of an affair between Samuel and the governess began. These tales seem to be confirmed when, the following year, the two were married. By June of 1860, Mary Drew had 3 children of her own and was pregnant with her 4th. Road Hill House had become quite full by this point, with Mary, Samuel and their 7 children being joined by 3 live-in maidservants. But despite the large number of persons in the household, the Kents were living very peacefully, seemingly having no issues whatsoever. Every evening, the family gathered for prayers before bedtime. Samuel and Mary slept in a second-floor bedroom with their daughter, Mary Amelia, in a cot. The nearby nursery was occupied by a nurse, Elizabeth Goff, 1-year-old Eveline and 3-year-old Frances. 16-year-old Constance and 15-year-old William slept in separate bedrooms, while the 2 eldest daughters, Mary Ann and Elizabeth, shared a room. The rest of the help, cook Sarah Kerslake and housemaid Sarah Cox, roomed together on the 3rd floor. The evening of June the 29th was much like any other for the residents of Road Hill House. While the Kents got ready for bed, the daytime staff left, locking the gate to the high fence surrounding the mansion as they went. Elizabeth put the youngest members of the family to bed in the nursery around 8 p.m, and by 11:30 p.m. Samuel had checked all the doors and windows of the house before retiring to the master bedroom. The large home then fell quiet, the peace only disturbed by barking from the neighbours' dogs around 1 a.m. Barking dogs are not an unusual event in the countryside, and so anyone in the house who may have stirred due to this noise would have quickly drifted back off to sleep. At 5 a.m. on June the 30th, 1860, Elizabeth Goff awoke. It was still early, but she decided to leave her bed and check on the children. She found little Eveline fast asleep in her crib, but when she turned to Frances's cot, the boy was nowhere to be seen. The young nursemaid wasn't immediately concerned, however, as Mary occasionally took Frances to the master bedroom at night. So Elizabeth returned to her bed and slept for another hour. At 7 a.m, as the house began to stir, Elizabeth knocked on Mr. and Mrs. Kent's bedroom door to ask if she should take the boy. Mary looked confused as she told the nursemaid that Frances wasn't with her and hadn't been so the entire night. A frantic search of the mansion quickly ensued, but the 3-year-old was nowhere to be found. According to Elizabeth, when she saw the boy's empty crib that morning, it still had the impression of where he had been lying. It was as if he had been softly taken out. Perhaps in denial about the situation, she remained adamant that Mary had taken the boy during the night. Though Francis hadn't been found, the search of the mansion revealed that a door had been left unlocked and a window left open in the drawing room. Suspecting his son had been kidnapped, Samuel sent one of his employees to alert the village policeman, his son William to fetch the local parish constable, and his daughter Constance to hurry to the local priest. The family offered a reward of £10 to anyone who found the child, roughly £1,000 in today's money.
Whilst this was going on, Samuel left for the police station in the nearby town of Trowbridge to report Francis missing there.
During his absence, the news of the boy's disappearance spread, and people of the village arrived at Roadhill House to assist in the search.
Among them were two men, a William Nutt, a shoemaker, and Thomas Benger, a farmer. As they entered the grounds, Nutt stated, "I shall look for a dead child as well as a living one."
With that said, they decided to check the staff privy, which lay amongst the shrubs in the mansion's grounds. When they opened the door, they were met with the most horrific scene. At their feet was a pool of blood. The privy, or toilet, consisted of a wooden seat above a pit. Between the seat and the pit was a splashboard laying roughly 2 feet deep. It was on this board that the two villagers discovered the bloodied body of Francis Saville Kent. His poor small body bore several vicious wounds, and he had been near decapitated. The body was examined by a family doctor who estimated the 3-year-old had died about 3 a.m. that morning. When Superintendent John Foley arrived at the family home around 10 a.m, he thoroughly examined the house. While Samuel Kent was convinced his son's killer was a stranger, the police weren't so sure, nor were the villagers of Road. In the following Monday's Evening Standard, a reporter wrote, "From the manner in which the child was taken away and murdered, the deed was done by some inmate of the house."
Naturally, the first person to fall under suspicion was Elizabeth Gough. She slept in the same room, and she failed to notify immediately her employers of Francis's absence.
Superintendent Foley, perhaps inspired by local rumours, painted a story of what he believed had happened. He claimed that Gough had sneaked a lover into her room that night, but they had been seen by Francis. The young boy was known to tell his mother everything, and so to silence him, two lovers smothered the boy and then mutilated his body to hide the true cause of death. Having already married a former employee, some even theorised that Samuel Kent had been the nursemaid's lover. Others claimed it was William Nutt, one of the men who had discovered the body. Elizabeth was eventually arrested on July the 10th, after which wild rumours about her confessing to the brutal murder began circulating in the village. But in the end, the rumours were only rumours, and because the police had little evidence for their claims, Elizabeth was soon released. The murder had drawn widespread interest, and Foley's failure led to the Wiltshire police receiving much criticism. With the investigation going nowhere, magistrates wrote to the Home Secretary to ask for a detective to be sent to investigate the crime. The Metropolitan Police stepped in, and on July the 15th, they sent the famous Inspector Jonathan Jack Witcher, dubbed Prince of Detectives by his colleagues, to look at the case. Detective Witcher quickly concluded that the open window downstairs in the drawing room was nothing but a red herring, meaning whoever the murderer was, they were part of the family or staff. The detective interviewed the Kent family's current and former employees and learned something interesting. Two of the older children, William and Constance, did not receive the same favour from their parents or other villagers as the rest of the Kent children.
After speaking with both teenagers and others who knew the siblings, Detective Witcher became more and more convinced that Constance had something to do with her stepbrother's murder.
The 16-year-old was described as having a strong, obstinate and determined will, and an irritable and impassioned nature, in addition to a powerful physique. It was no secret that she wasn't exactly happy about living under her stepmother's rule. When she was 13, she and her brother William ran away. Constance dressed as a boy, and the pair hoped to be taken on board a ship as cabin boys. However, they were captured in Bath and returned to Rhodes. Witcher also suspected Constance may have had some dangerous instability in her because of her mother, who was believed to have suffered from mental health issues. He believed she was wildly jealous of Francis. She had also previously hidden things in the outside privy. Lastly, the family laundress noticed shortly after Francis's death that one of Constance's nightgowns was missing, the same one she wore the night of the murder. While he lacked physical evidence to link the 16-year-old Constance to her brother's murder, Detective Witcher felt confident enough to arrest her on Friday, July the 20th. Constance asserted her innocence, and the Kent's staff stated they had never noticed any bad blood between her and her step-sibling. In fact, quite the opposite. Witcher's case hung on the missing nightgown, but a fresh search of Rhodes Hill House turned up nothing, and Constance was released on bail, embracing her father, who had come to collect her. The case against her was eventually dropped. Perhaps the nightdress had simply been lost after it had been sent to be laundered as Constance claimed, though perhaps not. You see, during the initial investigation carried out by John Foley, a heavily blood-stained nightdress was found stuffed inside a chimney in the Kent's mansion. Believing that the perpetrator would return to try and dispose of the item, Foley ordered it to be placed back inside the chimney. 2 officers were then told to stay on site so as to capture the murderer red-handed. A great plan. However, it was foiled when the 2 officers somehow found themselves locked in the kitchen, and by the time they were able to return to the chimney, the crucial piece of evidence had disappeared. With his investigation of the crime already receiving heavy criticism, Foley decided to suppress this information. Eventually, the investigation into the murder of Francis Kent hit a brick wall, but the public's interest was endless. To escape the attention, Samuel Kent moved his family to Wrexham in 1861 and sent Constance to a finishing school in Dinan, France. 2 years later, in August 1863, Constance returned to the UK and was taken on as a probationer nurse at St Mary's Home for Female Penitents in Brighton. The home cared for and educated the poor, unmarried mothers and ex-sex workers. Constance is said to have cared for them all, with her service being described as uniformly good by Reverend Arthur Wagner. It would be during her regular confessionals with Wagner that Constance would make the stunning confession that she had murdered her young stepbrother several years prior. And so, on April the 25th, 1865, perhaps seeking penance, 21-year-old Constance Kent walked into London's Bow Street Magistrates Court with a written note that read, quote, "I, Constance Emily Kent, alone and unaided, on the night of June 29, 1860, murdered at Rhodes Hill House, Wiltshire, one Francis Saville Kent. Before the deed, none knew of my intention, nor after of my guilt. No one assisted me in the crime, nor in my evasion of discovery." End quote. Detective Witcher, who had been ridiculed for his failure to solve the case and had worked hard to repair his reputation after returning to London, had been right all along. However, Constance said the murder was committed not out of jealousy. The public response to this confession was to dismiss it almost entirely. Instead of scorn, Constance received support, as many believed her confession to be a lie. They had already convinced themselves that the more salacious tale of Samuel Kent's affair with the nursemaid was the real truth, and that Constance was simply taking the fall for her father. Reverend Wagner also found himself coming under fire, figuratively and literally, both by those who thought he had forced the confession out of Constance and those who opposed his refusal to disclose to the court what she had said to him in confessional. Many protests outside St. Mary's ensued, with Wagner being assaulted by two drunks and allegedly shot at. Constance Kent's trial took place on July the 21st, 1865, and lasted less than 30 minutes. She pleaded guilty, refused to answer any questions, and was quickly sentenced to death by hanging. However, Queen Victoria commuted the sentence, perhaps due to Constance's young age at the time of the murder. In all, Constance Kent would spend 20 years in prison. After her release, she changed her name to Ruth Emily Kay and relocated to Australia, where she worked as a nurse and matron, dying in 1944 at the age of 100. While Constance Kent never recanted her confession, many still believe she wasn't the true murderer. Some think she was protecting her brother William. Others speculate Samuel Kent himself had something to do with his son's death. So, while the case of the murder at Road Hill House is officially solved, rumours about what happened that night persist more than 160 years later. Much like the case of Constance Kent, the story of Robert Coombes is one with a twist in its tale. It was 1895 and England was enjoying a very hot summer, which is probably why nobody paid very much attention to what the Coombes boys were doing. 13-year-old Robert and 12-year-old Nathaniel spent most of their days roaming the streets of East London's Docklands. The Coombes family was well known in the area. Its patriarch, Robert Sr., worked as a purser and chief steward for the National Steamship Company, a job that required him to frequently be away from home, travelling back and forth across the Atlantic. He was a hard worker who did all he could to provide for his wife, Emily, and their two sons. The couple settled into a terraced house, 35 Cave Road here in Plaistow, a poor working-class neighbourhood located in East London's largest borough. The pair were well liked by their neighbours, being described as very pleasant, cheerful people. Emily, in particular, was known to be an exemplary wife and mother, and also a careful housewife. These sentiments, however, would not be extended to the Coombes boys. Even as they excelled in school, their teachers sometimes regarded them as precocious and rude. They were described by their neighbours as being sullen and morose, resembling neither of their parents. Both Robert and Nathaniel were said to be deceitful and dishonest in small things, which led to some locals being critical of their mother for being too lenient. On July the 5th, 1895, Robert Sr. said goodbye to his 37-year-old wife and two sons before heading to the docks to board the steamship France, which was scheduled to set sail for New York City that day. Before departure, he made sure he left Emily enough money to cover all her household expenses, promising her he would be back in a few weeks with a hefty paycheck. 3 days later, his sons woke up early to head to St. John's Wood in North London, where they planned to watch a highly anticipated cricket match at Lord's Cricket Ground. Before leaving, Robert gave his neighbour, James Robertson, a half-sovereign and asked if he would mind paying the rent for them that day. When James asked about the boy's mother, Robert replied, quote, "We had a telegram late last night from Liverpool and she is going there. We've had a rich uncle die in Africa and Auntie wants to see Ma," end quote. When asked if she had already left, he stated that she hadn't, as she had had a fit, but maybe she will see Mrs. Robertson
before she leaves. With that, the boys went on their way. Emily Coombes was known to frequently travel to the northwest of England, where her wealthy older sister lived with their mother. Because of this, nobody in the neighbourhood was initially alarmed by her absence, but as days went by without them seeing her, they began to grow suspicious. Some asked her sons, worried about her well-being. However, both Robert and Nathaniel were adamant that their mother was fine and had simply left town temporarily. The boys spent the next few days out and about in London. First, to watch a play at the Theatre Royal in Stratford, then to the Pier Hill Fairground, where they spent several hours fishing. They were accompanied by 39-year-old John Fox, a friend of their father's who also worked for the National Steamship Company. He was said to be mentally challenged, which some believe was the reason why he didn't question Robert when asked to pawn some of the family's valuables, including a gold pocket watch that belonged to Robert Sr. During this time, the Coombes boys and Fox continued living at the small house in Plaistow, using the back parlour as their bedroom. When their funds began running low, Robert came up with a money-making scheme that involved asking for an advance of £4, roughly £420 today, from John Hewson, the chief cashier of the National Steamship Company. In his letter, he wrote that his mother was very sick and needed to pay an expensive doctor's bill. Hewson, however, was suspicious and refused to hand over the money. By then, the neighbours were no longer able to ignore their suspicions. They reached out to Emily's sister-in-law, who, coincidentally, was also named Emily Coombes. On July 15th, 1895, she arrived at the family's home in Plaistow, accompanied by her friend Mary Jane Burridge. They tried their best to enter the house, but were turned away by Fox, who told them Emily was away on holiday, before closing the door. At that moment, the Coombes boys arrived at the scene and were asked about their mother's whereabouts. Perhaps forgetting his previous tale, Robert explained that a rich aunt had died and had left them a lot of money. The pair then ran off into these playing fields. However, the story Robert told failed to satisfy the women, and 2 days later, on July the 17th, they returned to the property. This time around, they were able to get inside, where they found Fox and the two boys playing cards. Once again, Emily confronted Robert, asking him where his mother was. He replied that she was at a friend's house and he would take Emily to see her. The worried and frustrated sister-in-law put her foot down, telling Robert, "Your mother is in this house and I will not leave until the police arrive." According to the book The Wicked Boy by Kate Summerscale, what happened next was simply horrifying. Quote, "Mary Jane and Aunt Emily went upstairs, but when they tried to force the door, found that it would not give. They sent someone to fetch a spare key from the landlady. The key was brought and Aunt Emily opened the door to the bedroom. There, she saw the form of a woman lying on the bed, the face covered by a sheet and a pillow. Overcome by the smell of rotting flesh, she drew back and sent Mary Jane Burridge and her son to find a policeman." End quote. The Burridges immediately alerted Constable Robert Thwart, who rushed to the scene of the crime and turned down the bedsheets, uncovering Emily Coombes' decomposing body riddled with maggots. He also saw a knife on the bed and a truncheon on the floor, which he correctly assumed were the murder weapons. Upon seeing the corpse of her sister-in-law, Aunt Emily turned to her nephew and told him, quote, "You're a bad, wicked boy. You knew your ma was dead in the room and you ought to have told me." End quote. In response, Robert claimed that his mother had beaten his younger brother for stealing food and had threatened to do the same to him. Afterward, Nathaniel allegedly told him
that he wanted to stab her but couldn't, and so asked him to do it instead. Robert readily agreed, using the knife that Constable Thwart had found on the bed. He also confessed to pawning his family's valuables, saying that he had asked the impressionable John Fox to pledge in his place, since pawnbrokers didn't usually transact with children. While some police officers interviewed Robert, others went after his younger brother, who had managed to escape amid the chaos. Nathaniel was caught and brought back to Plaistow the same afternoon. When questioned, he claimed that he had nothing to do with the murder and that his brother had stabbed their mother while he was asleep in bed. The news of Emily Coombes' murder sent shockwaves across town, although locals were more horrified by the fact that her sons had stayed in the house and continued with their daily routine despite her body decomposing just a few meters away. The way that Robert described killing his mother was also chilling. By all accounts, his confession was straightforward and free from any emotion. It stated that after the murder, he had sprinkled lye over the body in an attempt to subdue the smell. Since the surrounding fields were being sprayed with fertilizer, this also helped mask the putrid scent. Thanks to the Children's Act of 1889, courts at the time defined children as any boy under the age of 14 and any girl under 16. While Robert and Nathaniel fell under this description, it was decided that they would still be held criminally responsible for their mother's murder, if it was proven that they were capable of discerning between right and wrong. The Coombes boys and John Fox were first tried at the West Ham Magistrates Court, which was responsible for determining whether they should be handed over to the Central Criminal Court at the Old Bailey to be tried for capital crimes. During the proceedings, prosecutor Guy Stevenson petitioned for Nathaniel to be discharged and considered a witness instead. Surprisingly, his request was granted. Nathaniel was reportedly terrified when he took to the stand and even sobbed while being questioned by Magistrate Ernest Bagley. The hearing ended after his testimony with the court ruling that Robert and Fox would both be tried for capital crimes. It was said that Robert was laughing as he was put into a cab and driven back to the Holloway prison where he had been staying since his arrest. Meanwhile, his younger brother was handed over to their mother's older sister. On September 16th, nearly 2 months after the gruesome discovery was made, the trial began at the Old Bailey in central London. During the proceedings, several witnesses were called to discuss Robert's mental health. Among them, his father, Robert Sr., who testified that his son regularly experienced debilitating headaches. He further stated that Robert had a difficult birth, with the doctors using so much force during his delivery that their medical instruments left permanent marks on his temples. This was corroborated by the family's physician, Dr. John Joseph Griffin, who also took the stand. Robert was very calm during his trial, even pleading guilty as his charges were being read out. However, his counsel, William Grantham, intervened, instructing him to plead not guilty. Robert's calmness may have stemmed from the fact that he was no stranger to courts. When he was 12, he had made his way to the Essex Assizes on his own to watch the trial of murderer James Reed. During his own trial, besides Robert Sr. and Nathaniel, Police Inspector George Gilbert also took the stand, testifying that he had uncovered a huge collection of penny dreadfuls while investigating the family home. At the time, penny dreadfuls referred to cheap precursors to comic books that published sensational stories, usually about detectives, criminals, or the supernatural. Robert was a big fan of these magazines, and for some, his obsession with such violent literature explained why he had been capable of brutally murdering his mother without feeling a shred of remorse afterward. It was said that Robert appeared to find this testimony ridiculous. According to the Wicked Boy, quote,
During Gilbert's evidence, Robert quietly laughed to himself. He began to make comical, grotesque faces at both the inspector and the judge. He stuck out his tongue at Justice Kennedy, who looked at him severely." End quote. The mocking and callous behaviour that Robert exhibited throughout the trial extended to his time in his cell, where he reportedly sang, whistled and frequently mocked the officers watching over him. More chilling, though, was the testimony provided by George Edward Walker, the medical officer of Holloway Prison, who had been in charge of investigating his mental health. During his time on the stand, Walker produced a letter that Robert had written to one of his neighbours, part of which stated, quote, "I think I will get hung, but I do not care as long as I get a good breakfast before they hang me. If they do not hang me, I think I will commit suicide. That will do just as well. I will strangle myself. I hope you're all well." End quote. But 13-year-old Robert was wrong. In the end, the jury found him guilty of murdering his mother, but insane when he committed the act. And so, he was taken to Broadmoor Hospital in Berkshire, England, a secure psychiatric facility where he was to be held indefinitely. Fox was found not guilty. In 1912, at the age of 30, Robert Coombes was finally allowed to walk free. Upon his release, he emigrated to Australia, following in the footsteps of his younger brother Nathaniel. When World War I was declared, he enlisted and served as a stretcher bearer in the Gallipoli campaign, where he was hit twice with shrapnel while carrying his fellow soldiers to safety. This led to him receiving the Military Medal for Conspicuous Bravery in the Field in 1916. After the war, Robert moved to New South Wales, where he led a quiet life as a farmer, milking cows and growing vegetables. He also taught music to the village children and was said to have taken in an 11-year-old boy named Harry Mulville, who was being abused by his stepfather. For the next 6 years, the two of them lived together. When World War II broke out in 1939, Robert enlisted again, even though he was already in his mid-50s. However, he was medically discharged before he could even set foot overseas. On May the 7th, 1949, he passed away, aged 65. Everything he owned, he willed to his adopted son, Harry Mulville. Our next two stories explore further cases where youth was proved no barrier for committing murder. The outbreak of World War II forced many to make difficult decisions, and such was the case for the family of Alec Lawrence. He was born in 1939, and the ferocity of the war seemingly grew in tandem with the young boy. This would culminate during the Blitz, when the Lawrence home was destroyed by a bomb, with Alec having to be dug out from the rubble. His family were far from wealthy, and trying to find a new home while caring for a young child proved difficult. However, their neighbours George and Helena Story were not deaf to the family's plight. George was an accountant, while Helena was deeply involved in the local community and worked for several charities. Despite living nearby, their house was untouched, and they offered to look after Alec while the Lawrences got back on their feet. Though this had initially been seen as a short-term arrangement, the Lawrences' struggles seemed to last longer than they had foreseen. They eventually realised that their stories could offer their youngest son a much better life. And so when the Stories moved here to Pirbright, Alec moved with them. As the years progressed, Alec lived a life of luxury compared to the siblings he had left behind, and he attended the prestigious Mill Hill Public School. Despite these advantages, he was far from happy. He would still visit his family in London, But the difference in their lifestyle and experience soon began to form a gap in their connection. At the same time, he struggled with the pressures that came with life, with the stories. He failed several subjects at school and would become extremely sick and anxious as exams approached. His education would have cost a pretty penny, and so he felt as though he had failed his foster family. It was with these thoughts clouding his mind that Alec began his national service in 1957. At the time, it was required that all able-bodied men between the ages of 18 and 30 serve at least 18 months in the military. The following year, in February of 1958, he returned to the Story home on leave. Early on Tuesday the 11th, apparently wanting to keep sharp, he borrowed a .22 pistol and 17 rounds of ammunition from his neighbour. Alec told his neighbour this was for target practice. He returned with the weapon to his bedroom. Alec would later claim that while twirling the gun, it went off, sending a bullet through the floor. Nobody was harmed, but Helena was obviously shocked by the noise, and Alec rushed downstairs to tell her what had happened. Together, they went upstairs to assess the damage. It was clear that his foster mother was upset at the damage caused. Alec still had the gun in his hand as Helena knelt to look at the hole in the floor. He raised the weapon and shot her once in the head. She slumped forward and he shot her several more times until the gun was empty. George Story was away in London at the time, so the first anyone knew of the murder was when Alec handed himself in at Knapp Hill Police Station. There, he confessed, stating he had just shot his mother. His statement continued, quote, "Lena told me her bad eyesight was due to her health, and they would try and fix her up with some glasses to stop her going blind. This was a great shock to me. I have often thought I would do something to put her out of any misery she would be likely to suffer. I did not get the pistol for that purpose, but when I had got it, I thought it would be better to kill her for her own sake." End quote. In his mind, he had apparently saved Helena from a fate worse than death. Alec was quickly arrested, and his trial began in May of the same year. His defence concentrated on the Cinderella story of his being whisked away from a poor home to live with a wealthy family, but how this had led to him feeling disconnected from both. His defence counsel, Mr. F. Lawton QC, said, quote, "He did not belong to anybody, either to Mr. and Mrs. Story or to his parents." There was no claim that the 52-year-old Helena had been unkind to him in any way. By all accounts, she was a very kind person. Instead, they argued that because Alec had a strong bond with her, he didn't want her to suffer after she had told him of her failing eyesight. It was also mentioned that he had felt he had failed the Stories. At the end of the trial, a jury found Alec Lawrence not guilty of capital murder, but of the lesser crime of manslaughter. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison, with the judge stating, quote, "Everyone in this court trusts that the future will be rosy, but much may depend on you. I trust that at the end of it, you will be able to come out and be a man." End quote. Not much is known of what became of Alec after this point. So what do you feel about the case? Is it a tragedy in which we should feel almost as much sympathy for the perpetrator as the victim? Or do you think that the outcome was a little too lenient? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Most weekends you'll find plenty of children here playing football in Mayfield Park in Southampton. And such was the case on Saturday the 20th of February 1960. Away from the pitches, others would be playing in the woods, and it was here where 9-year-old Iris Dawkins played cowboys and Indians with her friends and her older brother Malcolm. As they were playing by a small stream, Iris slipped and fell into the water.
Muddied and with her shoes sodden, she left her brother and headed home to get changed around 4 p.m. The walk should have taken roughly 20 minutes, so when Malcolm arrived home at around 5 p.m. and his parents had seen no sign of his sister, alarm bells began to ring. The police were alerted and a search was quickly underway. Tragically, at around 11 p.m, Iris's body was found in the woods where hours earlier she had been playing carefree. She had been stabbed nearly 40 times. An investigation was started immediately, with police asking anyone in the area that day to come forward. With many playing and watching football on the fields at the time, the police soon heard from over 100 people. They also visited several schools in the area and questioned children who may have been playing in the park that day.
With this approach, they soon uncovered their first lead.
A 9-year-old boy, also named Malcolm, told police that an older boy who had been in the park the week before the incident pushed Iris down an embankment. When Malcolm went to help her, the boy threw a knife at him. It missed, but the bully said he would hurt them if they told anyone about what had happened. Later, this story would prove to be a fabrication. Children making up stories to be in the limelight would plague the investigation.
As the month progressed, the police held a reenactment in the park and conducted door-to-door inquiries, carrying with them a knife sheath that had been found in the woods.
These inquiries soon yielded results, as a 10-year-old boy named Jeffrey came forward, stating he had seen Iris making her way home on the day of the incident. No one else had come forward to say they had seen her after she had left her brother and his friends. This meant the boy was the last person to see Iris alive. February 29th, he was taken to the Bittern police station and questioned extensively. During the interview, the boy built on the story he had initially told. He said he had been kicking a football around in the park that day. He also stated that he had a knife with him. Apparently, during the kickabout, the ball had ended up in the woods where he saw Iris, and the pair began to play chase. Jeffrey then explained that during the game, Iris had fallen and he had fallen on top of her, and that the knife may have gone into her, maybe more than once. Newspapers would quickly latch on to comments he made about seeing stabbings on TV, saying that they weren't real, as you'd see someone killed one week and back the next. The boy was quickly arrested and charged with the murder of Iris. However, it would take until July of that year for his trial to begin. Medical evidence was provided that showed her 39 stab wounds. 3 could have caused her death, while many were inflicted after the fact.
Despite recanting the story he told earlier, what he said in the interview would later work in the boy's favour.
The location where he said the incident had taken place didn't match where Iris was found, and his description of what she was wearing was also off. This, combined with the lack of a weapon and no blood being found on his clothing, meant the case quickly fell through, with Jeffrey being found innocent. Just another child who had been led along during the interview or had embellished his story to gain attention. Despite the swiftness and size of the initial investigation, after this setback, the case would quickly go cold. It would be 8 years before a new lead would be revealed in a rather bizarre way. On November the 18th, 1968, off-duty police constable Dennis Luty was walking his dog in Mayfield Woods. Sophie was a very well-behaved Doberman pinscher, so when she suddenly began barking at a bush, Luty knew something wasn't quite right. Sure enough, a man emerged from the foliage and quickly made his way out of the park. Perplexed by what had just transpired, Constable Luty followed him at a distance.
The man came here to Archery Road, where he began to look at the houses very closely.
Believing that he was trying to burgle one of the properties, Lutty stopped and searched the man, whereupon he discovered he was carrying a large sheath knife. With this, the man, now known as Keith Ridley, was arrested and taken in for questioning. At the police station, 22-year-old Ridley initially stated that he had been lying in wait in Mayfield Park in the hope he could steal someone's wallet.
Ridley then revealed he had indeed not been there to find someone to rob, but rather find someone to murder.
Chillingly, he calmly went on to say, quote, "I get the urge to kill every so often. I had bought the knife and came out with the intention of killing someone. I'll tell you now, I killed someone in Mayfield Park about 10 years ago. Her name was Iris Dawkins." He went on to recall his actions in gruesome detail. The, at the time, 13-year-old Ridley had watched Iris leave her brother and friends before pursuing her into the woods. He then forced her at knife point into a bush and stabbed her to death. Fast forward to March the 17th, 1969, and Ridley's trial began at Winchester Assizes. Once again, though, evidence was thin on the ground, and his defence pointed to parallels between the case and that of the boy from 9 years prior. This time, however, it wasn't a young boy making the claims, but a young man, and the details he revealed about the crime matched many that had not been made known to the general public. Alongside this, his brother would say in court that in 1959 he had a sheath knife that he would play with. One day, he stuck it into the door of a shed in his garden before heading out. On his return, the knife was gone. He then threw the sheath away. This, he thought, was the sheath that police had taken door to door, and he now believed that his brother had taken both items using the knife in his horrid crime. Less than 10 days after proceedings had begun, on March the 26th, 1969, a jury found Keith William Ridley guilty of Iris Dawkins' murder.
Due to his age at the time of the murders, he was sentenced to be detained at Her Majesty's pleasure. And because of this, the amount of time he spent behind bars is unknown.
Marie and Frederick Manning's marriage was far from being a happy one. However, their vow of "until death do us part" wouldn't go unbroken. Marie Manning was born Marie de Rue in Lausanne, Switzerland in 1821. Her parents were fervent Catholics who believed their daughter's future lay in a nunnery. However, Marie thought otherwise, and a way out presented itself in the form of a bandit named Montano. He whisked the young Marie off to his gang's abandoned mansion in the Swiss Alps, where the pair lived a life of crime. Well, not exactly. While some stories about this case includes this tale from Marie's early life, these wild yarns were likely invented after the fact by overzealous writers such as Robert Hirsch, who was described as being an unscrupulous scribbler. In actuality, not much is known about Marie's early life in Switzerland. What we do know is that her parents passed away when she was a teenager and she emigrated to England, finding work in Devon as a lady's maid for Lady Anna Polk, the wife of MP Sir Lawrence Polk.
Later, she moved to London and worked for the Duchess of Sutherland's daughter, Lady Blantyre, here at her lavish home, Stafford House.
Living and working amid such elegance and frippery soon imparted on Marie a taste for the finer things in life. To return to the comparative squalor of her early life was unthinkable. In addition to her taste for luxury, Marie, or Maria as she was sometimes known, was described as a charismatic young woman with a magnetic personality and good looks. She definitely did not have any shortage of admirers. This initially flattering situation would eventually turn deadly. In 1846, it was claimed that Marie was set to rendezvous with her mistress in Boulogne, France. While on board a ship crossing the Channel, she met Irishman Patrick O'Connor. There were immediate sparks between the two, despite O'Connor being some 20 years her senior.
Patrick was a man of independent views, a crooked customs inspector who combined smuggling with moneylending to build himself quite the fortune. This excited the young servant.
In the end, Patrick promised Marie that he would take her out as soon as he returned to London. Other reports from the time state that Patrick and Marie were already well acquainted by this point, with the pair having an on-again, off-again romance. One thing that is certain, however, is that Patrick had a rival for Marie's affection, a man named Frederick Manning. He was a London native and closer to his lover's age, and while he worked as a guard for a railway company, he was set to inherit a fortune from his mother. It's likely that the pair also met during Marie's travels with her mistress. Both men often gloated to friends that they were set to meet their lover at the prestigious Stafford House. Among many other dignitaries, Queen Victoria herself was a regular visitor to the stately home. However, Fred and Patrick's visits were strictly confined to the servants' quarters. Marie knew the situation with her lovers couldn't last forever, and she wanted to settle down with the man who would keep her living the lifestyle she had become accustomed to. She believed Patrick was that man, though letters she wrote to him showed her growing frustration that he had still not proposed to her. In 1847, with Patrick dallying, Fred seized the opportunity and popped the question himself. He assured Marie that he would inherit a fortune on his mother's death, enough for the pair to live very comfortably. With this assurance, Marie accepted the proposal, and the pair were married in St. James's Church in Piccadilly. Understandably, Patrick did not attend the wedding, though he did send the blushing bride a letter shortly after the ceremony. In it, he declared his eternal love for her and claimed he had been about to propose before she said yes to Fred. Of course, we do not know if Patrick was telling the truth, but his words did not help the new union. Perhaps that had been the point. The newlyweds received a further setback when Frederick lost his job with Great Western. While we do not know precisely why he was given the boot, it seems there was suspicion that he may have been involved in a robbery. Though not enough evidence was found to charge him with the crime, he was nevertheless discharged. Marie would have believed that the pair would be settled and starting a family by this stage. Instead, they were now searching for a way to make a living. They eventually decided their best option was to return to Fred's hometown of Taunton, where they used their savings to buy the White Hart pub. This was a far cry from the lifestyle Marie had imagined for herself, and things got worse when rumours began circulating around town that Fred had been seeing other women. She had apparently also been seeing Patrick, staying with him on several occasions. Whatever the state of the Mannings' relationship, it was put under further stress at the beginning of 1849. 2 train robberies had taken place on the Great Western Line between Plymouth and London. The perpetrators were 2 men, Henry Poole and Edward Nightingale. Poole was good friends with Frederick, and it was discovered he and Nightingale had stayed at the White Hart the night before the job. While the investigation found the Mannings played no part in the crime, some newspapers claimed that the police had received a tip-off about the robberies. The finger was pointed firmly in Marie's direction, with it being thought that she had sought Poole's arrest as proxy revenge for Fred's infidelities. The pub's connection to the crime and talk of Marie being a snitch led to dwindling business at the White Hart. Because of this, the pair would eventually move back to London, where, for a time, they would run a pub called the King John's Head, though this would also prove unsuccessful.
Eventually, the couple made their home at 3 Miniver Place, Bermondsey, southeast London. There, they let out rooms to make ends meet. By now, Marie had realised that Fred had been lying to her about his inheritance, specifically how much money there was. Not as much as Marie had been told, that was for sure. Patrick regularly visited number 3 Miniver Place and occasionally lodged there. By this point, Frederick had become a heavy drinker, and O'Connor feared he would one day come home drunk and confront him. This turbulent love triangle between Marie and her lovers would reach its tragic conclusion in August 1849. Despite his dalliances with smuggling and extortion, Patrick O'Connor was rarely absent from his day job working on London docks. So when he failed to show up 2 days in a row, alarm bells began to ring. More so for one man in particular, his cousin and workmate, William Flynn. After finishing his duties, William decided to investigate. He spoke with 2 of Patrick's friends at his lodgings. They explained that they last saw Patrick on Thursday when he told them he would be having dinner with his girl, Marie. William then spoke with the landlady, who told him that Marie Manning had visited Patrick's apartment on Thursday and Friday evenings, but she had not seen Patrick with her. William did not need to hear any more. He was sure something had happened, so he contacted the police. Authorities arrived at the Manning residence the following day. They found Marie home alone. She told them Patrick had never come for dinner on Thursday and that she had only visited that evening and Friday to see if he was ill. When police asked about the whereabouts of Fred, Marie said her husband was at church and added that they had plans that evening, so the house would be empty if the police decided to pay another visit. Nevertheless, 3 days after Patrick's disappearance, William arrived at the Mannings' home with a police officer. There, Marie told him the same story. She had not seen Patrick. William did not buy it. Even more convinced that something terrible had happened to his cousin, he began to give out leaflets promising a £10 reward for any information. Still, it was not until he searched Patrick's apartment that he began to fear the worst. There, he discovered securities and cash that he knew Patrick kept on hand were missing. He believed Marie was somehow involved, but before she could be questioned further, she fled from her home on Miniver Place with luggage in tow. The contents of the house had also been sold. A manhunt was launched, and at the same time, the police decided to take another look around the Mannings' house, even though the initial search had turned up nothing. They dug up the back garden, but came back empty-handed. However, on Friday, someone noticed that their flagstones in the kitchen had been scrubbed clean. Upon closer inspection, it seemed that they had been recently relaid. They decided to remove the stones and dig at the disturbed earth. They didn't have to dig far. At roughly a foot deep, they discovered the naked body of Patrick O'Connor, covered in quicklime. He had been shot and bludgeoned. Exactly what had happened on the evening of August the 9th was only known by those present at the time: Patrick, Marie, and Fred. But in a supposed confession, Frederick would later state that Marie had been behind the murder. He claims she was angry at O'Connor as he owed her money for 3 weeks of lodgings. He had also apparently been the main reason she had decided to take on the King John's Head pub, which had lost the couple some £100. That equates to some £16,000 today. She wanted his money and revenge. Marie then set about regularly inviting O'Connor over for food and drink and visiting him at weekends so they'd appear to be on good terms. During the many visits, it said that O'Connor commented on the hole gradually being dug in the kitchen, but was told it was simply plumbing work. On the night of the murder, he had arrived at the Mannings' home as he had done many times before. Marie claimed they were expecting guests and told O'Connor to wash his hands. He initially refused, but she insisted.
As he stood at the sink, she placed one hand on his shoulder and lifted a pistol to his head with the other before pulling the trigger. Frederick goes on to say that she then raced to him and said, quote, "Thank God, I have made him good at last. It never will be found out, as we are on such exceedingly good terms. No one will ever have the least suspicion of my murdering him." End quote. When Fred went to see what his wife had done, he apparently found O'Connor still alive, groaning on the floor. It seems not enough gunpowder was used, or the caliber was too small, as while the bullet had fractured O'Connor's skull, it hadn't pierced it. Instead, it had slid around to below his eyebrow. Mr. Manning then states he picked up a crowbar and finished him off. The pair then stripped and buried the body beneath the kitchen floor. How much truth is to be found in Fred's confession is debatable. Still, it's true that Marie went to Patrick's house over the following 2 days and collected his railway share certificates, cash, and other valuables. Despite now having everything they desired, the gravity of their actions and the position they now found themselves in began to weigh heavily on the murderous couple. What remained of their relationship quickly evaporated as each became suspicious of the other. As police began sniffing around, the pressure became too much, and Marie fled to Scotland with most of their stolen goods. Soon after, Fred realised he had been left behind and sold all the furniture in their home before fleeing to Jersey. Marie was the first of the pair to be captured. During her escape, she had left several boxes at London Bridge Station. These contained blood-stained clothes along with letters sent between herself and Patrick. Keeping a low profile didn't come naturally for Marie, and it was soon found that she had purchased first-class tickets to Edinburgh. Police in London quickly alerted their counterparts in Scotland via telegraph. Authorities there already had their eye on the fugitive, as she had been trying to convert some of the shares that had been reported stolen into cash. A week after her escape, Marie Manning was arrested. Fred took slightly longer to track down. Though he had travelled to Jersey with plans to move on to France, he had instead begun drowning his sorrows on the island. An acquaintance on the journey over had recognised him and informed police of his location after reading of Patrick's death. On August the 30th, Frederick Manning was arrested and immediately laid the blame at the feet of his wife, saying he was entirely innocent. By this point, newspapers had already dubbed the case the Bermondsey Horror, and delighted in the thought of how many issues the story of a female murderer with links to the aristocracy would sell. The initial inquest into events revealed that Fred had had disturbing conversations with a medical student who lodged at their home. During these, he asked about the effects of chloroform and if a drugged person could sign a cheque if asked. It was also shown that Mrs. Manning had purchased the lime and a shovel. At the time, a wife couldn't be charged as an accessory after the fact for murders carried out by their husband, as wives were bound to loyally follow their spouses. However, if she had been involved in the planning or taken part, that's a different story. The Mannings' trial took place at the Old Bailey on October 25th and 26th. It was initially argued that the jury should contain people of French or Swiss descent so as to be fair to Marie. This idea was thrown out as it was said that her marriage to Fred made her an English citizen. Ultimately, it would take these jury members 45 minutes to find Frederick and Marie Manning guilty of murder. Before passing sentence, the judge asked the pair if they had anything to say. Fred remained silent, but the usually calm and collected Marie launched into a tirade stating there is no justice for a foreign subject in this country. She continued to plead her innocence as the judge gave the inevitable sentence of death. The former servant even attempted to use her connections to procure a royal pardon, but the letters she sent went unanswered. After the trial, the murderous couple would be kept apart, though they exchanged several letters, each beseeching the other to confess. I address you as a fellow sinner and a fellow sufferer, and not as my wife, since the contract must be considered as cancelled, extending as it does only until death and not beyond it, and both of us standing as we do on the brink of eternity. I implore of you to be truthful in all you utter. I address you as my husband. I am far away from my happy native land on account of this contract and this land which you have made to me a captivity. All I have to beg of you now is to state facts, as you know that I was not in the house when O'Connor met with his death. In the end, neither backed down from their version of events, and on November the 13th, 1849, they were united one last time in the chapel of the Horsemonger Lane jail. The condemned pair shared a few words, kissed and embraced. They were then led out onto the rooftop where the scaffold had been erected. Newspapers claimed some 30,000 people had turned out to watch the spectacle. Among them was one, Charles Dickens, who had turned up to watch the crowd. He would later write of the barbarous nature of those present. While Fred averted his gaze from these onlookers as he stood beneath the noose, Marie opted to be blindfolded as she was led to her fate. Moments later, the couple dropped through the trapdoor, parted by death. Some crimes seemingly have a way to play out in the same way time and time again. Such was the case for the Brighton trunk murders. June 17th, 1934 was a sunny day in Brighton. It was Sunday and visitors flowed through the station in waves, stepping into the bright day with suitcases and hat boxes in hand. Many hardly noticed as they passed the left luggage department windows where a cloakroom attendant from the Southern Railway named William Joseph Winnecombe was shifting items around. Inside that room, Winnecombe was biting back his gorge as he searched for the source of a sickly smell. He traced the putrid odour to a plywood trunk which had been left unclaimed for over a week. Unable to bring himself to pull the latch, he alerted the police. When Chief Inspector Ronald Donaldson opened the mysterious trunk, the source of the stench was far more gruesome than Winnecombe could have imagined. Inside, wrapped in brown paper, was a dismembered torso of a woman. The discovery of any human remains is undoubtedly a jarring and traumatic event, immediately initiating a flurry of activity. Investigations are launched, crime scenes are secured, and suspect lists are compiled. But finding a headless, limbless torso in a discarded trunk at a railway station raised some novel questions. Had the remains been transported by train? From where? And where was the rest of this woman's body? Investigators immediately alerted other stations throughout England of the discovery. They urged them to be on the lookout for similarly gruesome packages. As employees at dozens of stations sorted through rooms of left baggage, railway clerks at London's King's Cross found another piece of the puzzle. An unclaimed suitcase contained a pair of legs that matched the Brighton victim's torso. The press pounced on the gruesome tale of body parts being shuttled around England aboard the rail system. They dubbed the mystery victim Pretty Feet, deciding that the corpse's extremities looked as if they belonged to a dancer. The story was across the nation, and horror only grew when it was revealed the autopsy of the corpse determined it belonged to a 25-year-old female who was 5 months pregnant at the time of her death. In a classic case of the press ascribing blame to the victim, a local paper printed speculation that the woman had died during a back alley abortion operation and the abortionist had panicked, dismembered her corpse and sent it via rail to all corners of the country. Chief Inspector Donaldson was following a similar line of investigation. The post-mortem notes from Sir Bernard Spilsbury read, in part, internal examination of the torso had not revealed the cause of death. The legs and feet found at King's Cross belonged to the torso. The victim had been well nourished. She had been not younger than 21 and not older than 28, had stood about 5 feet 2 inches and had weighed roughly 8.5 stones. She was 5 months pregnant at the time of death. Despite no evidence of a failed abortion procedure, Donaldson, like much of the public, believed there was little other explanation for a healthy, young, pregnant woman to be found dead other than by her own misadventure and subsequent attempt to rid herself of the consequences. He shifted the focus of the investigation onto one suspect, a known local abortionist named Dr. Edward Messiah. He instructed his officers to tell the man, and one approached the doctor, expecting him to come quietly for questioning. Instead, Messiah presented the investigator with a list of names, wealthy, connected, important people in Brighton who were his clients and would not react kindly to their medical provider and secret keeper being dragged into the public eye. A senior official told Donaldson it was time to back off. Tired of being eyed with suspicion everywhere he went, Messiah moved his practice to London, where a patient would later die under his care during an abortion procedure. Again, the doctor evaded prosecution by hiding behind his connections. Eventually, he retired to Port of Spain, the capital city of Trinidad and Tobago. There, he fell from public consciousness as quickly as he had arrived. And while some think the doctor was a murderer who got away, even Donaldson was forced to admit the body appeared to have been dismembered with no real anatomical skill, leaving the doctor an unlikely suspect. With Messiah offering veiled threats to law enforcement and little tying him to the crime, investigators turned to other possibilities. The cases of 700 missing women were reviewed, and police checked hospitals for other known abortionists. They also began a thorough search of the area near the train station in Brighton, hoping to uncover a new clue which could breathe life into the case. And on July the 16th, in a flat on Kemp Street, less than 100 yards away from the left luggage room in Brighton station, they found another trunk. The flat was occupied by a 26-year-old man named Tony Mancini, who had, by all accounts, disappeared just days earlier. Inside was the body of Violet Kay, a known sex worker and girlfriend of Mancini. Kay had moved to Brighton from London with Mancini the year prior. The 42-year-old had danced in touring revue shows for years before turning to sex work to subsidise her heavy alcohol and drug use. Mancini had a troubled past himself. A petty criminal with a record including theft and loitering, his real name was Cecil Lewis England, and Tony Mancini was just the latest in a long string of aliases. After arriving in Brighton, the couple bounced from address to address until Mancini found work at the Skylark Cafe as a waiter and bouncer. The pair had a notoriously volatile relationship marked by heavy drinking, drug use, jealousy, and explosive arguments. On May the 10th, Violet stormed into the Skylark and drunkenly accused Mancini of having an affair with a teenage waitress at the cafe. The scene was unpleasant for all, which made it easy to remember as the last time anyone saw Violet Kay alive. Days after the fiery cafe confrontation, Mancini told his colleagues that Violet had left him and gone to Paris. In a move that did not read as a broken-hearted lover, Mancini then passed her clothing and possessions to the waitress his girlfriend had accused him of sleeping with. Around the same time, Kay's sister-in-law received a telegram from Violet that said simply, "Going abroad. Good job. Sail Sunday. Will write. Vi." The newly single Tony moved to new lodgings at Kemp Street, where he placed a trunk at the foot of his bed, draped it with a cloth, and used it as a makeshift table. Visitors to the flat said the box leaked and reeked of death, but it didn't seem to bother Tony. It wasn't until he learned of the searches in connection with the Brighton station torso that he abandoned his trunk and ran. When the investigators discovered the foul-smelling box on Kemp Street and pried it open, they found another dead body. This time, identifiable as that of Violet Kay. On July the 18th, Tony Mancini was apprehended in London and escorted back to Brighton for questioning. He didn't pretend to be ignorant of the corpse rotting away at the foot of his bed, and he had a story ready to explain it. He told investigators that after their public argument at the Skylark Cafe, he had returned to their shared flat to find Violet lying across the bed, already dead and cold. Terrified that he would be blamed for her death, he purchased a trunk to store the body in and then moved it to Kemp Street. Unconvinced, the authorities charged him with the murder of Violet Kay. His trial was held shortly before Christmas 1934. The evidence against him was damning. The telegram sent to Violet's sister-in-law had been sent from Brighton after the victim died, and it appeared to be in Mancini's handwriting. One witness testified that he had asked her to provide an alibi for him should he need it. Others said they had overheard Mancini boasting about giving Violet a great hiding spot. Evidence was introduced, including marks on the victim's skull that appeared to be caused by a hammer, and blood stains on Mancini's clothing. By the time the prosecution had wrapped up their case, it seemed Tony Mancini was done for. That is, until the defence took to the stand in the form of none other than Norman Burkett, one of the most prominent criminal defence barristers of his time. Burkett was known to successfully defend clients who had watertight cases against them. He was a gifted speaker and an expert at inserting doubt into the minds of the jury. He painted a picture of a couple who was very much in love, with Mancini, a consummate victim of Violet's jealous rages and drug use, which he believed ultimately ended her life. He claimed Mancini had felt compelled to lie because he feared the police using his past record as a reason to not believe his innocence. He argued that it was far more likely that Kay, a known sex worker, had been killed by a client. His arguments were compelling and persuasive, and after just 2 hours of deliberation, the jury found Tony Mancini not guilty. He was a free man, and in the eyes of the law, he had committed no crime. Perhaps the mountain of evidence against him had simply been circumstantial, and those who thought him guilty were just mistaken. Then again, perhaps not. Decades later, Mancini confessed to the murder of Violet Kay during an interview with a News of the World journalist. He said that during an explosive argument, Kay had attempted to attack him with a hammer they used to break up coal for their fire. He wrestled the hammer away from her, and when she demanded it back, he hurled it towards her head, hitting her left temple and killing her. Despite this confession, prosecutors ruled he could not be tried again, and the killer was never brought to justice. Following the not guilty verdict and his trial, investigators felt the saga of the Brighton trunk murders had reached a dead end. No evidence to tie Mancini to the Brighton station woman had ever surfaced, and the hunt for other illegal abortionists had proven fruitless. With little else to print about the 1934 murders, newspapers turned their attention to a third Brighton trunk murder more than 100 years earlier. In August 1831, a labourer working in Preston Park noticed a patch of soil that seemed to have been disturbed. Upon inspecting the patch, the man saw what appeared to be a dress sticking out from the dirt, and a foul odour seeped from the ground. He fetched the local police to investigate, and they discovered a woman's torso buried in a shallow grave that had been mostly washed away due to recent rains. The woman's head and limbs were missing, and she was carrying an unborn child. The fabric of the dress the woman was buried in was recognised as belonging to Celia Holloway. It didn't take the police long to narrow the list of suspects down to just two: Celia's husband John and his illegitimate second wife, Anne Kennett. Celia Bashford was working as a servant at a tavern in Brighton when she met John Holloway, a local gambler and petty criminal. Holloway was ambivalent about his new beau, but when Celia became pregnant, he was forced to marry her after being arrested on a bastardry warrant. The child that forced the union ended up being stillborn. The second child, a baby girl named Agnes, died just before her first birthday. John, who viewed their entire life together as a farce, was quick to take a job as a sailor and met a woman named Anne Kennett, whom he married illegally and brought home to Brighton. The newlyweds lived under the assumed names Mr. and Mrs. Goldsmith at 7 Margaret Street. But John Holloway never completely severed ties with Celia, and in the spring of 1831, both of his wives revealed to him that they were pregnant. A magistrate ordered Holloway to pay his estranged pregnant wife 2 shillings a week, a nearly impossible sum for him to keep up with. On July 14th, he collected his wife from a friend's house under the pretense of resuming a normal married life with her. He took her to a small house where Anne Kennett was waiting. John strangled her as Anne looked on, telling him, "Don't let your heart fail you." After Celia stopped moving, John cut her neck in 2 places for good measure and hung her body in the closet. The next day, they dismembered her body, placing her head and limbs in a bag, which they dumped in the privy at their home on Margaret Street. They put her torso into a trunk, and John transported it atop a wheelbarrow to a footpath in Preston Park, where he smashed up the trunk and buried the pieces along with what remained of Celia. John Holloway confessed to the murder, while Anne Kennett maintained her innocence, calling her husband a liar, blackguard and deceitful wretch. Anne Kennett was acquitted of any wrongdoing, thanks to the jury's belief that a woman was incapable of such malice and the brand new baby she carried into the courtroom. The jury found Holloway guilty of murder, and he was executed on December the 21st, 1831. The hanging of John Holloway was the only semblance of justice in the century-long saga of the Brighton trunk murders that took the lives of 3 women. Violet Kay's murderer confessed to the crime and escaped without punishment, and the woman in the trunk at Brighton station received even less closure. The rest of her remains were never found, and the identity of Pretty Feet remains a mystery. Perhaps the legacy of the Brighton trunk victims is that after hearing this story, you will likely pay more attention to the luggage that rolls past you at the train station, never forgetting the horrors that a simple suitcase can conceal. Sometimes the justice system can unwittingly aid a murderer, as was the case when Timothy Evans was found guilty for the crimes of another man. John Christie moved into a flat at 10 Rillington Place in 1937. Though now known as one of London's most exclusive neighbourhoods, at the time Notting Hill was a run-down area of large houses split into multiple units after servants fell out of fashion with the upper middle class and families moved to smaller, more manageable homes. Number 10's tenants lived in squalor, cramped and unmaintained rooms and sharing one outdoor lavatory. But for John Christie and his wife Ethel, the flat represented a fresh start. The couple had married in 1920, but split just 4 years later. Their marriage was plagued by John's impotence, a miscarriage, and Christie's regular visits to sex workers, the only women with which he felt he could perform. Ethel returned to her family in Yorkshire, while John spent the better part of a decade in and out of prison. His first arrest happened less than a year into his marriage, when he was convicted of stealing postal orders while employed as a postman in Halifax. 2 years later, he was convicted of obtaining money on false pretenses and violent conduct. Next were 2 counts of larceny in 1924. After his release, Christie took a job driving a lorry and stayed out of trouble for a while. But in 1929, he attacked a woman he was living with, hitting her over the head with a cricket bat. The magistrate that presided over the case called it a murderous attack, but sentenced the man to just 6 months in prison. After his release, he stole a vehicle and was re-imprisoned. Perhaps it seemed inevitable to Christie that he'd spend his life behind bars, as he had always struggled to find his place in society. Born near Halifax as the 6th in a family of 7 children, he had a troubled childhood with a distant, uncommunicative father and unpredictable mother. Alternatively bullied and coddled, John lived in constant fear of how he would be treated by the adults around him, especially his grandfather, who lived with the family and terrified the boy. When his grandfather passed away, 8-year-old John relished the sight of him lying dead and powerless on the trestle table. But perhaps there was no one he disdained quite as much as his sisters, who he felt simultaneously aroused and emasculated by, as they constantly bullied him and bossed him around. The tug-of-war between a forbidden temptation and deep resentment left John impotent and angry at women. At 15, he left school and took a job as a projectionist at a local cinema. Then, the onset of World War I found him enlisted as a signalman in the Duke of Wellington's regiment. In June of 1917, he was injured in a mustard gas attack that left him unable to speak loudly. However, author Ludovic Kennedy would later posit the lifelong effect was one contrived entirely by John's imagination, a ploy for attention and sympathy. Either way, it was a soft-spoken war veteran that Ethel Simpson fell in love with in 1920 and then entrusted with a second chance for happiness 14 years later. After their reconciliation, John continued to visit sex workers but ended his career in petty crime. He took a job as a foreman at the Commodore Cinema in King Street and, to outsiders, appeared to have settled into a quiet life with Ethel at 10 Rillington Place. At the onset of World War II, he applied to join the War Reserve Police, ever the eager patriot. He was assigned to the Harrow Road Police Station, where he met Gladys Jones, the wife of a soldier serving abroad. The two began an affair that lasted until Gladys's husband returned in mid-1943. After learning about the affair, the soldier tracked Christie to the house he shared with Gladys and assaulted him. We may never know if it was this instance that pushed John Christie off the ledge on which he was precariously balanced, but shortly after losing his lover and suffering a round of blows by her husband, Christie embarked on a decade-long string of heinous crimes that left at least 8 people dead. Ethel, finding little to keep her with a deceitful husband, in a dirty apartment, spent most of her time in Yorkshire with family. Taking advantage of her absence, Christie trolled bars and alleys for sex workers to invite back to number 10 for the evening. On August the 24th, 1943, he met a 21-year-old Austrian munitions worker named Ruth First at a snack bar in Ladbroke Grove. Christie says he spotted her soliciting other men and invited her back to his apartment. Some versions of the story have Ruth cast as a repeat visitor to Rillington Place, others as a stranger who fell into the wrong hands for an hour that would end her life. In the most dramatic tellings, she was in love with John, and while at his home one day, he receives a telegram from Ethel saying she was on her way home with her brother in tow. Ruth begs him to run away with her, and when he refused, she stripped naked and pulled him into bed. In every version, the bed is where Ruth meets her fate and is strangled to death. He wrapped her in her coat and placed her body under the floorboards in the front room. Later, he buried Ruth's body in the garden behind the house. After Ruth's murder, John resigned as a constable and worked as a clerk at a radio factory in Acton. In 1944, one of his co-workers, Muriel Eady, began complaining of a sore throat that developed into bronchitis, leaving the woman gasping for breath after coughing fits. On October the 7th, John invited Muriel to his flat after work, promising that he had concocted a special mixture learned from his days practicing first aid with the War Reserve that could cure her. After serving her a cup of tea, he instructed the woman to inhale from a jar with the tube inserted in the top. But instead of a medicinal cure, the vessel contained domestic gas, high in carbon monoxide, and a pungent tincture called Friar's Balsam, smelling only the intensely sweet aroma of the tincture. Muriel breathed deeply until she fell unconscious. John Christie then raped and strangled her before burying her in the garden beside Ruth. While Christie's first known murder was spontaneous, his second had been carefully calculated. According to some sources, John had befriended Muriel and her boyfriend months before the murder, selecting her as his target from the first. The couple had visited John and Ethel at Rillington Place before, and the foursome had even been on double dates to the cinema. All of this was a ruse to ensure Muriel would trust him implicitly. Then, John waited for Ethel to visit her family and prepared the tools he would need to trick Muriel into inhaling the gas. Each murder was equally horrifying, but the progression in planning and detail in such a short time is a grim foreshadowing of what was to come. During the Easter holiday of 1948, the Christies welcomed new neighbours. 24-year-old Timothy and 19-year-old Beryl Evans were a newlywed couple who had been living with family but moved to their own flat when they learned they were expecting their first child. Despite being fresh, their marriage was not a happy one. They had loud, angry fights about Beryl being a poor housekeeper and Timothy spending all his wages on alcohol. His heavy drinking only exacerbated his short temper, and his inability to provide for the family was a sore spot that easily irritated him. Tim was Welsh, born in Merthyr Tydfil to a single mother who first noticed her son's cognitive limitations when he was piecing his first words together. Try as he might, he could barely speak. Later, he would struggle through school, an uphill battle made worse by the onset of a rare medical condition at age 8 that resulted in him missing months of learning. Timothy was prone to violent, unpredictable tantrums and fought constantly with his mother and her new husband. He moved in with his grandmother, but she too could not keep him in school and under control. He developed a reputation for habitual lying and creating self-aggrandizing fantasies he shared as the truth. By the time Timothy Evans reached adulthood, he was nearly illiterate. His IQ hovered near 70, leaving him unable to perform the complex tasks required at most well-paying jobs. His string of low-paying physical labour jobs and drinking habit left his family with little money. Beryl Evans gave birth to their daughter Geraldine in October. The young family spent the first year of Geraldine's life in a constant financial struggle. So when Beryl learned she was pregnant again, she decided to have an abortion, despite the procedure being illegal. Timothy was initially reluctant, but eventually agreed that it was for the best. On November the 30th, 1949, Timothy Evans staggered into the police station at Merthyr Tydfil with a confession. He had attempted to help Beryl abort the fetus with a concoction he'd created and, in doing so, had accidentally killed her. He claimed to have disposed of her body in a sewer drain, arranged for Geraldine to be looked after, and then came home to Wales. But when police searched the drain in question, there was no sign of a body, and the cover was far too heavy for a single man to lift. Beryl Evans and baby Geraldine were missing, but it was clear that Timothy's confession was not entirely truthful. When he was questioned again, Timothy's story changed. This time he alleged that his neighbour, John Christie, had offered to perform the abortion. When Timothy returned home from work, he told him his wife had died during the operation. He also told Evans that he needed to run. Abortion was illegal, and Timothy had arranged the procedure. Christie promised to place Geraldine with a couple he knew, and Evans fled to Wales. But when he returned to London a few weeks later, Christie refused to give him Geraldine. Desperate to discover where his daughter was, Timothy Evans readily confessed to the murder of his wife. During a search of 10 Rillington Place on December the 2nd, police found the body of Beryl Evans in the wash house in the back garden. She was wrapped in a tablecloth, and baby Geraldine was found under a pile of wood nearby. Both victims had been strangled. Timothy Evans was presented with the clothing Beryl and Geraldine had been found in and told how they had been killed. It was the first time Evans realised that his daughter was not tucked away in a cosy flat, as John Christie had promised. Over the next few days, police interrogated Timothy about the deaths. He was visibly distraught and suffering from sleep deprivation. According to the transcribed police record, he admitted to strangling his wife during an argument over debts and then strangling Geraldine 2 days later. There was no physical evidence to tie Evans to the crime, and experts would later assert that his contradictory statements point to a coerced confession. It didn't matter. Timothy Evans was charged with the murders. His trial began on January the 11th, 1950, at the Old Bailey in central London. By then, Evans had withdrawn his confession, aided by his solicitor, Malcolm Morris. He said he feared the police would hurt him if he didn't give them the confession they demanded. He again claimed that John Christie was responsible for the murders, but Morris warned him that this would be difficult to prove and advised him to choose a different defence. But he was adamant, even volunteering to take the witness stand to plead his case. John and Ethel Christie were the prosecution's star witnesses. John denied ever having offered to abort Beryl's unborn child, and both testified that they had heard heated quarrels which they believed to be physical between Tim and Beryl. Morris attempted to discredit Christie's testimony and build a case that placed him as the prime suspect by outlining his criminal past. While Evans had no previous run-ins with the law, John Christie had struck a woman over the head with a cricket bat. Ironically, This tactic may have worked in Christie's favour. The jury saw a man who had reformed his life of crime, served his country, and worked as a special constable. Surely, if John was still a violent man, it would have come to light in the 17 years since his last arrest. Plus, he had no motive for murdering Beryl and her daughter. By all accounts, they barely knew each other. Evans, however, had provided a clear-cut motive when he confessed to the police. The trial lasted only 3 days, with little evidence presented. In essence, it was one man's story against the other. Christie was impressive on the stand. He was pleasant, soft-spoken, and took great care answering each question. He told the jury about his recurring medical ailment that often left him housebound and in great pain. Evans, on the other hand, was less than convincing. He came across as cagey, desperate to withdraw the numerous confessions he had given police throughout their interrogations. He appeared not to be a grieving husband, but a man trying to escape blame by casting it on another. It didn't help that he had a long history of telling lies. When the jury emerged after only 40 minutes of deliberation, they found Evans guilty and he was sentenced to death. In the months between his conviction and execution, Timothy Evans never wavered again in his version of events. He appealed his conviction to no avail, and on March the 9th, 1950, he walked silently to the gallows at Pentonville Prison, where Albert Pierpoint waited with a noose. We can only wonder if later Pierpoint learned about the long string of mistakes in the investigation. When searching 10 Rillington Place, police overlooked a femur propping up a fence in the small garden. And had they dug just a foot below the surface, they would have discovered the bodies of 2 other victims killed years before Evans had arrived. The bodies were so poorly buried that Christie's dog unearthed Muriel Eadie's skull just days after the search. John threw the skull into a bombed-out house on St. Mark's Road. Later, a group of kids would discover it and turn it over to the police, who assumed it belonged to an unaccounted victim of the Blitz. Then there were the builders, who had been working at Rillington Place when Evans was supposed to have hidden the remains in the wash house. They were willing to testify that, as they entered the wash house daily to store and retrieve tools, they never saw the bodies, the pile of wood, or smelled decay. When they finished their work on November the 11th, they thoroughly cleaned the small space to ensure nothing was left behind. But they were never called upon to testify, and Malcolm Morris overlooked their ability to prove that Timothy's confession had been, at the very least, incredibly flawed. When the police interrogated Evans in London, they revealed the location of the bodies and the manner of death from the start, information that should have been kept from him to force a confession of the hiding place. The confession recorded by police contained phrases and vocabulary that seemed inconsistent with that of a man who could barely read. They were riddled with police terminology that Evans would have no way of knowing, pointing to the possibility that the constables had filled in quite a few blank spaces on their own once Timothy Evans was finished. For all their interrogation, police accepted John Christie's statements without scrutiny. They were aware of his violent record, but his time as a War Reserve policeman earned their trust, and they readily believed his version of events. After Timothy Evans' execution, John found work as a clerk with the British Road Services in Shepherd's Bush. Back at Rillington Place, new neighbours moved in, migrants from the West Indies. Both John and Ethel held bigoted views towards people of colour, and friction between the Christies and their new neighbours was constant. Tensions came to a head when Ethel accused one of her new neighbours of assault, with John using this to help petition for the continued exclusive use of the back garden, claiming to need space from his undesirable housemates. More likely, He was afraid one of them would uncover the bodies buried there. But John Christie had bigger problems than his new neighbours. On December the 14th, 1952, he strangled Ethel in their bed. Maintaining a plausible explanation for his wife's sudden disappearance wasn't easy. He responded to letters from her family in Yorkshire claiming that Ethel had rheumatism and couldn't write. He told neighbours who inquired after her that she was away visiting relatives. Having resigned from his job and unable to find another, John sold Ethel's wedding ring, watch and most of the furniture in the flat. On January the 26th, 1953, he forged his wife's signature to empty her bank account. A month later, he sold her clothing. His neighbours began to notice that his flat and garden had a strong smell of disinfectant. Eventually, he stopped bothering to answer letters from Ethel's family. In March, he invited a woman looking for an apartment to rent to look around his flat. John had likely been attempting to lure her to her death, but she arrived with her husband and the couple offered 3 months' rent in advance for the space. Christie borrowed a suitcase for his few remaining belongings, and on March the 20th, 1953, he bid Rillington Place farewell. The couple moved out as quickly as they arrived, having learned from the irate landlord that Christie had no right to rent to them. Of course, by this time, no one knew where he was. Now that his former apartment was vacant, an upstairs tenant named Beresford Brown asked the landlord for permission to use the flat's kitchen. But a sickly smell permeated the space, no matter how many times Brown scrubbed it. On March the 24th, he was attempting to hang brackets for a radio on the kitchen wall when he discovered a hidden alcove behind the wallpaper. Peeling the paper back, he glimpsed what looked like a woman's naked back inside the wall. When police arrived and opened the alcove door, they found 3 bodies. There were also a few loose floorboards in the parlour where they found Ethel's remains. While Ethel's body decayed below the floorboards, John murdered at least 3 more women at 10 Rillington Place. 25-year-old Rita Nelson was pregnant and needed an abortion when John Christie promised he could help her with his special gas. Kathleen Maloney was a 26-year-old sex worker Christie met at a cafe near the flat. Hectorina McLennan was living in London with her boyfriend and looking for an apartment to rent. John Christie befriended the couple under the pretense of considering a sublet to them and eventually lured Hectorina to number 10 on her own. All 3 victims were gassed, raped and strangled. He wrapped their bodies in blankets, stowed them in an alcove behind the kitchen wall and wallpapered over the door. When police searched 10 Rillington Place this time, they finally dug up the back garden too and found the remains of his other victims. After leaving, Christie rented a room in King's Cross for 7 nights under his real name. But when he heard that the police had searched his apartment, he took to the streets instead, sleeping rough and spending the day in cafes and cinemas. On March the 31st, Christie was approached by a police officer and refused to reveal his identity. The officer arrested and searched him, discovering a newspaper clipping about the arrest of Timothy Evans amongst his items. John admitted to murdering his wife and the women in the alcove immediately. On April the 27th, 1953, he admitted to the murder of Beryl Evans and shortly after to those of Ruth First and Muriel Eady, though he did not confess to the murder of baby Geraldine, likely in hopes of preserving a shred of sympathy from the jurors when he pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. On June the 22nd, the trial for the murder of his wife began at the same court in which Timothy Evans had been tried and convicted 3 years earlier. Christie's defense argued that he was suffering from severe mental illness and had only vague memories of the murders themselves. But a psychologist who examined Christie testified that while the man had a hysterical personality disorder, he was not insane. The jury found John Christie guilty of the murder of Ethel Christie, and he was sentenced to death by hanging. He filed no appeal and saw few visitors in his final days before being hanged at 9 a.m. on July the 15th, 1953 at Pentonville Prison. His executioner was Albert Pierpoint. It's likely that Pierpoint, along with most of London, had not forgotten that Timothy Evans had been executed for a murder based almost entirely on the testimony of the man who now found himself dangling from his noose. The Home Secretary commissioned an inquiry into the conviction of Evans to determine whether a miscarriage of justice had occurred. Christie was interviewed before his execution, along with 20 other witnesses involved in the investigations and trial. The week-long inquiry determined that Evans was guilty of the murder of his wife and daughter, and that Christie's confessions were unreliable, likely a ploy to pad his defence of insanity. The findings sparked a public outcry, eventually leading to a second inquiry in 1965. This time, the conclusion was that Evans had likely killed his wife, but not his daughter. This was still a significant finding since, despite there being 2 victims, he had been tried and sentenced for only one murder, that of Geraldine. The Home Secretary recommended a posthumous pardon, which was granted on October the 18th, 1966. Still, it wasn't until 2003 that the Evans family was awarded compensation for the miscarriage of justice. The Home Office also issued a statement that there was a lack of evidence to implicate Timothy in his wife's murder, which was most likely committed by John Christie, clearing him of both accusations. Despite this, in 2020, Beryl's brother Peter Thorley revealed in a book that he still believes Evans was behind the murder of his sister and niece. He states that as a teen he would regularly visit his sister at 10 Rillington Place and felt as though John Christie and Ethel were like an aunt and uncle to him. In his version of events, the violent Evans killed Beryl and Geraldine, with Christie unable to inform the police due to the dead bodies that already lay in his back garden. What do you think? Could Evans have committed these crimes after all, or is Thorley's account clouded by his hatred of the man who regularly beat his sister? The one truth that is certain is that at least 8 people tragically lost their lives at 10 Rillington Place. The gruesome acts that occurred there left an indelible mark, and in the 1970s, the building, along with the rest of Rillington Place, was destroyed. Though the location no longer exists, the memories of the horrors that took place there still live on. The twisted case of Robert and Sonny Mone brings a morbid tone to the phrase, like father, like son. Robert Francis Mone was born in Dundee in Scotland in June of 1948. When he was 2 years old, his mother left the family home, leaving Mone and his 2 sisters to be raised by their father, Robert Mone Sr., who went by the nickname of Sonny. Despite this chipper moniker, he was in fact a violent and abusive alcoholic who handled any issues in his life with physical force. The type of man who took pleasure in the pain he inflicted on others. To compound this situation further, Robert would later claim that during his youth he was molested and abused by one of the family's neighbours. He attended St. John's Secondary School, but battled with routine tasks and was even described as a hand grenade waiting to go off by one teacher. Perhaps unsurprisingly, considering his home life, Robert had poor social skills and didn't know how to make friends. He was an outcast who was generally disliked by those around him. This led to him getting into many physical altercations as a youngster, dealing with situations in the same way his father would. One such outburst would lead to him being expelled from St. John's. Robert was then sent to an approved school in London. Approved schools are a kind of residential institution where children deemed uncontrollable could be sent to receive tuition. However, the change of scenery and approach did little to shift his temperament. It was the same story as it had been previously. He was violent and lacked any form of friendship with other students. When his time at the approved school was done, Robert returned to Scotland, where he joined the army, becoming a member of the Gordon Highlanders. Though he now had more routine and structure in his life, the issues he faced as an adolescent seemed to follow him into adulthood, and the now 18-year-old began drinking heavily. After completing his training, he was stationed in Germany, where his feelings of desolation grew. He didn't get along with his fellow troops, with them seeming to openly dislike him. More so after he gave evidence against two of his superiors that saw the pair court-martialed and discharged. Mone was further ostracized after this event and even received threats of violence against him. He apparently took these seriously and sought to carry a weapon for protection, though he abandoned the process when he discovered it would need to be held in the armoury while he was on base. In October of 1967, Robert's unit was set to travel to Libya on a posting, but Mone was told he wouldn't be joining them. Instead, he was informed he would return to London, where he would receive further training before joining a different unit. This enraged Robert, who believed he was being punished for doing what he thought was right. He returned to London, but instead of going to the base, he went straight to a gun shop, purchased a shotgun, and went AWOL. With no plan of what to do next, Mone eventually found himself back in his hometown of Dundee. There, he spent the days drinking and wandering the streets aimlessly, waiting for the pubs to open. For a time, he stayed with relatives, but a drunken row which ended with Mone threatening his father at gunpoint saw him thrown out into the street. His mental state began to deteriorate as he slipped deeper into his depression. On October 31st, 1967, he checked into a cheap hotel and attempted to take his life, but only succeeded in making himself ill. The next day, Robert drank in a pub near St. John's, his old school. There, he examined his situation while stewing over his hatred for the school, where he felt his life had been derailed. Eventually, however, he decided he would return to London and face head-on whatever punishment awaited him for going AWOL. He stepped out of the pub in search of a cab to get his journey started, but there were none to be seen. November's weather was cold and wet, and Mone soon found himself sodden. His only warmth came from the anger growing inside him. In an instant, he made a decision that would alter the course of his life and many others. Instead of continuing to try and get a taxi or go back inside to calm down, Robert returned to his hotel room and got dressed in his army uniform. He grabbed his shotgun, hid it in a paper bag, and walked back out into the rain with his eyes set on St. John's Secondary School. Robert entered the building and ascended a flight of stairs, but the classroom he initially entered was empty. He then moved on to one wherein Nanette Hansen was teaching 13 young female students needlework. 26-year-old Nanette was a Yorkshire native who had only been in Dundee for 6 months. She had recently married, and despite her short time in the area, Hansen had made a very positive impression and was very well liked by colleagues and students alike. The tranquility of her classroom that day was shattered when Mone, dressed in military uniform and brandishing a shotgun, burst into the room. Since this scene was so out of the ordinary, some of the girls began to laugh, thinking this was a prank. This further fueled Robert's anger, and he fired his gun into a glass door, injuring a teacher. Now realizing they were in grave danger, the class began to panic. Mone then barricaded the door with the students' tables. He threatened them as he lined up bullets on the teacher's desk and placed the gun against the heads of those who screamed too loudly. Mone then ushered the girls into an annex as he strode around the classroom, stating he was doing this as revenge for being expelled years earlier. His actions that day led to later speculations that Robert suffered serious harm at that school. His anger and hatred towards the establishment didn't quite align with him simply being a troubled boy who was expelled. He would later state that the fear he instilled in the girls made him feel powerful. However, one person was not scared. Throughout his ranting and raging, Nanette Hansen remained calm, asking the gunman about his life, the army, and other things to try to defuse the situation. Robert felt she was disarming him and so wanted to intimidate her, though she remained strong and tried to convince him to release her students and keep her as the sole hostage. By this point, police alerted by the teacher who had been injured were now on the scene. They evacuated the other students and teachers and set about negotiating with the hostage taker, Mone. His increasingly erratic behaviour worried them. He had initially shot at the officers before approaching the door with his gun pressed against one of the girls' heads. Mone then gathered 3 girls in the centre of the room before molesting and assaulting them. He told police the only person he'd talked to was Marion Young, a woman he had met at a youth centre years earlier and whom he had a crush on. Marion, who was now studying to become a nurse, was soon tracked down and bravely agreed to face Robert. He would later state that she now seemed very businesslike and different than she had been before, which made him feel intimidated. Just over an hour into the siege, and Nanette and Marion now sat facing the gunman, trying to convince him to let the girls go. Eventually, Mone seemed to lose all interest, and Nanette and Marion were able to usher the girls to safety. However, the gunman refused to let the women leave. In his twisted mind, Mone was assessing the situation. In a later interview, he stated that he had decided to lay siege to the school and that someone would die. He believed that if they didn't, he would have failed like he had failed at school and in the army. The room had a large window, and Robert asked Nanette to draw the curtains so the police couldn't use a sniper to kill him. She complied, and as her back was turned, Mone raised the shotgun and pulled the trigger. Nanette collapsed to the ground, mortally wounded. She would sadly pass away in the hospital a short while later. She had been 6 months pregnant at the time. After shooting her, Mone then placed the gun on the desk and waited to be arrested. He would later speak of the brave woman he had just callously murdered. Quote, "I had been powerful for the first time in my life when I went into that room, but she had taken it from me just by being gentle and strong and decent." End quote. Nanette Hansen and Marion Young, who had attempted to save her life, were awarded the Albert Medal, later the George Cross, for their brave actions that saved many lives and prevented a larger tragedy. Robert Mone spent the next couple of months being examined by psychiatrists who eventually diagnosed him with schizophrenia, though some modern doctors believe this wasn't the case. With this diagnosis, however, he was deemed unfit to plead, and so, on January 23, 1968, a judge ordered he be held at the State Hospital in Carstairs indefinitely. At the State Hospital, he began studying towards a degree, wrote a play, and joined the hospital drama group, though the most significant revelation for Robert was that he was gay. He seemed to be making progress. However, Mone was far from rehabilitated. One of his fellow inmates at the hospital was a man named Thomas McCulloch. In 1970, he had shot and injured 2 hotel staff members after an argument about a bread roll. Perhaps unsurprisingly, he was quickly diagnosed as a psychopath and sent to the state hospital, where he met Mone, with the pair entering into a relationship. Years passed by, with the relationship only growing stronger, and in 1976, the pair decided to formulate a plan of escape. Thomas had been a painter and decorator before his incarceration, and he joined the drama club as a set designer, where he began to slowly gather useful tools and potential weapons. They also had items to help disguise themselves, like fake beards, moustaches, and any sort of uniform they could get their hands on. These items they hid behind a fake wall they had built inside a cupboard. November 30th, 1976 was the chosen day. At 6 p.m, they left the drama club with concealed weapons and walked to the social club. Inside were patient Ian Simpson and nursing officer Neil McClellan. The 4 men were the last ones in the building, and the plan was that the would-be escapees would incapacitate the men, tie them up, and escape. However, this wasn't to be. Thomas started the attack, throwing paint stripper into Ian's face, and Robert followed suit, doing the same to Neil. Instead of falling to the ground, the 2 men put up a fight. Thomas and Robert pulled out their weapons, with Thomas being the primary attacker. When they were done, Neil and Ian were left lifeless and near unrecognizable. McCulloch returned to the drama room to retrieve an axe, which he used to mutilate the 2 men. By the time their bodies were discovered and the alarm raised, the pair had scaled a barbed wire fence with a handmade rope ladder and escaped. The next part of the plan involved getting a vehicle. They stopped in a nearby road and Robert lay down, pretending to be injured, while Thomas used a torch to get the attention of passing vehicles. Robert McCallum was the first to see the men and stopped his car to help them. Luckily for Robert, before he could even get out, a police patrol car rolled up with 2 officers inside, PC John Giles and PC George Taylor. They had also stopped to give help, but upon seeing them, Robert let up. Instead of trying to run, the escapees brutally attacked the officers with their weapons. PC Taylor would eventually succumb to his wounds. Seeing all of this happen, Robert McCallum got into his car and drove straight to the state hospital to inform them what had just happened. Mone and McCulloch jumped into the police car and sped off, but they wouldn't get far. 10 miles from the hospital, the car slid off the road and crashed into an embankment. Robert went through the windscreen and for a brief time was rendered unconscious. Thomas managed to stop another vehicle on the road, a van driven by William Lennon and Jack McElroy. When they got out to help, he and Mone attacked them before bundling them into the back of the vehicle and driving off. As before, however, they didn't make it far. Thomas mistakenly believed that lights he saw up ahead were a roadblock and so veered into a field where the van quickly became stuck in the mud. They set off on foot, leaving the 2 injured men in the van. Robert and Thomas made a beeline towards a farmhouse, crossing muddy fields and a river. There they barged inside and demanded the family hand over the keys to their vehicle. They obliged, and the 2 men were once again on the road in the 3rd vehicle of the night. This time they made it further than they had previously, but now had police in tow as they crossed the border into England. The chase ended when a police van rammed the vehicle, causing it to crash. Unperturbed, the escapees attempted to steal a car that had stopped due to the crash. When police attempted to stop them, they were attacked. McCulloch tried to stab one officer, who had to grab and hold the blade of his knife until backup arrived, and the pair were arrested. The men were once again examined to assess their mental states, with both being found to have been sane at the time of the murders. This raised questions as to why they were being held at the state hospital in the first place. However, this also meant they could plead and stand trial, and early in 1977, McCulloch pleaded guilty to all 3 murders, while Mone pleaded guilty only to the murder of Officer Taylor. The judge, Lord Dunpark, who was known to be lenient, made history by passing down the first life sentences in Scottish history. This meant the men would not be released until found to be of no threat to the public at large. McCulloch served his time in the remote Peterhead prison, and after a review of his sentence was released after 36 years, aged 65, in 2013. Mone was sent to Perth prison, where in 1981 he staged a rooftop protest. While inside, he also transcribed books into Braille and studied law and philosophy. However, he also had 6 months added to his sentence after attacking another prisoner with boiling water. Since then, he has been moved from one institution to another and is currently one of Scotland's longest-serving prisoners. However, the story doesn't end there. You see, it would later transpire that in terms of evil, Robert Mone Jr. had apparently learned a lot from his father. Instead of being disgusted at his son's actions, Sonny Mone loved that he had committed such heinous acts. He regularly bragged about them, praising Robert for killing a pregnant woman and escaping the state hospital. Sonny also proudly wore Robert's ring that his son had sent him for safekeeping. Understandably, Robert Sr. wasn't well liked in his community. Sonny Mone's violence was not just confined to his family, and he had a long list of convictions under his belt. On December the 29th, 1978, while sitting in a pub, Sonny Mone decided he wanted some of his son's infamy for himself. He started writing down the names of the people Robert had killed. Robert Sr. wanted to kill at least as many, if not more. In early January 1979, police were alerted to a missing person, 78-year-old Agnes Waugh, Sonny's elderly aunt. She was a frail woman who didn't travel much, so her not being seen was strange. Agnes lived in a block of flats called the Grey Memorial House. Locals called it no man's land, as only single women were allowed to rent there. Detectives went to the flats and visited Agnes's apartment. She wasn't there, so they knocked on the other doors to see if anyone had helpful information. When they got to the final flat, no one answered. Something felt off, and officers decided to look inside. As soon as that door opened, a horrific smell wafted out. Inside the flat were the dead bodies of 3 women, later determined to be Agnes Waugh, 70-year-old Jane Simpson, and 29-year-old Catherine Miller. It was Jane's flat, and all the women had been dead for a few days. Each of them had been strangled and savagely beaten. When inspecting the bodies, something stood out to both the detectives and the coroner. Marks and bruises on the women's bodies showed what appeared to be the outline of a very distinctive ring. An investigation was started immediately, and it wasn't long before they had Sonny Mone brought in for questioning. He admitted to being in Jane's flat on December the 29th, but said another man was also there, Stuart Hutton, known locally by his alias Billy Rebel. Sonny claimed he left after the group ran out of alcohol and didn't return. When police tracked down Billy, he told detectives that he had been there with the 3 women and Sonny that day, But he was the one who left after the alcohol ran out. Unlike Sonny, Billy could prove that he was the one who left, since he went and placed some bets, which the police confirmed. Though they had placed Mone at the scene of the murder, the police felt they required more evidence against him. They felt that if they could find the ring that had left the mark on the women's bodies, the case against Sonny would be solid. Search warrants were issued and police trawled Mone's home, hangout, and even his ex-wife's house, but to no avail. Despite this setback, it was decided that with the little evidence they had, Mone would still be arrested and charged. On January the 18th, 1979, officers moved in and arrested Robert Mone Sr., and on his hand was the ring they had been searching for. When the ring was compared to the markings found on the women, it was deemed a perfect match, and the blood found on it matched that of one of the victims. Sonny's trial was held in June of '79, and there he was found guilty of all 3 murders and sentenced to life imprisonment. As he was led away, he struggled and fought with the officers, aggressive and defiant to the end. He was sent to Craiginsh's prison in Aberdeen, where he quickly set about making himself the most hated man there. He regularly fought and argued with other prisoners, gloated about his actions and the tattoo on his chest, IHS, which he stated stood for "in his service," referring to the devil. He was described as probably the most obnoxious man in the country, and just over 3 years into his sentence, one of his fellow inmates stabbed him to death. Thank you for watching, and thank you to our members and patrons. Your support is greatly appreciated. Right then, take care, and I'll see you next time with another story to make you say, "Well, I never."